So why don't we get started? We have as a very special guest speaker today, Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. Actually, we found out about this serendipitously. Dr. Nadelmann was meeting yesterday with President Carter and the son of the governor around issues related to substance use policy, and this was our opportunity to grab him for Emory for a lecture within public health. Dr. Nadelmann is the founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, the leading organization in the United States promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. Dr. Nadelmann is a JD and PhD in political science from Harvard and has a master's in international relations from the London School of Economics. He also taught at Princeton for 7 years. He's authored 2 books, Cops Across Borders and Policing the Globe, and his writings have appeared in most major media outlets in the United States, as well as Science, International Organization, Foreign Affairs, The Nation, and other publications. So it's really a treat to have you here, and in particular to have you here in a school of public health, talking about reframing the issue of drug abuse policy in the United States as a public health issue. Nice to have you.
Thank you very much, Ben. If there's a way to just get a little water, it would be helpful. But other than that, I'm good. Yeah, I have to say, I've almost never been to Atlanta. The first time I came down was back in the mid-'90s, like '94, and there was a little meeting around drug policy reform, and a very brave fellow named Steve Jones, who was working at CDC then on HIV issues, and when the whole needle exchange thing was just beginning, and he showed up at the meeting, and I think helped organize it a bit, and that night there was a press release from Senator Coverdell of Georgia, basically threatening CDC's financial future for having any association with this sort of stuff. So I think things have evolved a bit since those days. I wouldn't say they're where they should be today, but this really is a bit. And this is a trip also. I should say, in terms of my work, it's actually I came down to brief President Carter, who had spoken out internationally on drug policy a few years ago, and then I thought made some comments on the marijuana policy stuff a few months ago that I thought were unfortunate, and so his folks wanted me to brief him. And then I met with the Georgia's Justice Policy Project, which is working on racial justice, incarceration issues. I spoke to the Peachtree Normal, which is the normal marijuana consumers organization in Georgia. I met this morning just now with Sanjay Gupta, who did that great special on marijuana recently, and just to pitch him on a whole bunch of other ideas around drug policy, some of which I'll talk about right now. And then I'm going to go from here to meet with the governor's son, Jay Neal, who's a drug court judge, and then go from there to the Divinity School. So it's a nice little spectrum of the range of the life of drug policy reform when things fall into place. I think the best thing that I could do is to really talk about, I could go on for hours, but I do need to leave just about 1 o'clock, is to explain what drug policy reform means and its link with harm reduction and drug treatment and the criminal justice system, and to give you a frame for understanding this, and then to talk about some of the key issues that lie within the sort of political debate and in the public health community and all of this sort of stuff. It's a lively moment too, because some of my colleagues were just at the American Public Health Association meeting last week, and a couple of resolutions that we had worked on were passed. And I understand there's now some growing interest at APHA in terms of a resolution on marijuana law reform as well, which I'm very delighted to see that things are moving along and they're willing to engage on this issue. Now, I started off as an academic, but I've always felt personal and passionate about this issue. And people ask me how I got involved, and part of the answer was growing up in a traditional religious family and then going off to college in the mid-1970s. Actually, at McGill in Montreal I started. And, I started drinking with my friends, and we started smoking cannabis. And, I enjoyed it. It wasn't a problem for me. It wasn't a problem most people I knew. Some people had a problem, and some people were getting arrested. And the sort of fact that this alcohol, which was so much more of a, I mean, I liked it, but there's so many more disgusting things associated with it compared to marijuana, that kind of hit me. And then it kind of kept popping up, and my research interests moved that way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I eventually worked in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau for a year, and writing classified report on money laundering, interviewed drug enforcement agents around the world, but also reading deeply on the history, on the comparative policy element, on as much as I could about how we got to our current system. So my driving passion in life is ending the drug war. It is the belief that the war on drugs, this punitive prohibitionist policy of dealing with drugs, certain drugs, not all drugs, is fundamentally wrong-headed, it is ineffective, it is remarkably costly, it is counterproductive, and most importantly for me, it's immoral. I mean, I basically regard this as a moral struggle, and I regard the war on drugs as the immoral approach to dealing with it. What do I mean by the war on drugs? Essentially two things. I mean, first, the presumption, the assumption that certain drugs need to be treated first and foremost as criminal problems. Not those drugs, these drugs, right? Alcohol did that criminal thing for a few years back in the 20s, decided it didn't make sense, right? Tobacco, hopefully we don't go to the point of criminalization. And I hope if anybody in a public health community thinks that criminalization of cigarettes is ultimately the answer, please, let me walk you down from that ledge, because you could be generating a war on tobacco that would make the war on drugs look, even worse down the road, right? And the pharmaceuticals sort of in between, the caffeinated beverages sort of there. But over here, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, meth, blah, 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 right? All criminal, touch it, sell it, grow it, breathe it, you're a criminal, right? That's one part of the war on drugs. The second part, which is a more distinctively but not uniquely American element, is this belief that there is essentially no permissible relationship between us as adult human beings and these substances. That the only permissible relationship is sobriety or abstinence, right? It's essentially a sort of moralistic notion with sort of religious origins, the notion of my body, you heard this during alcohol prohibition days, as God's vessel, and my moral obligation to keep this vessel pure, right? And it means that even when we recoil a bit at the criminalization of things, we still believe in a kind of conscious or unconscious moralistic sort of way that there's a duty to be as drug-free as possible or totally drug-free, and that we need to push people toward that objective of abstinence. That is always the optimal place to be for human beings, to be abstinent, right? Now, I mean, if you want to back away from this a second, what underlies that apart from the moral notion? I think part of what underlies it is a kind of, almost a belief that somehow we all emerge from our mother's wombs as perfectly balanced chemical creatures. Right, out there. And if only we can maintain that state of drug-freeness, throughout, wouldn't that be great? But of course it's not true. We don't emerge all perfectly balanced, right? I mean, I was a very sweet kid. My brother was born a year and 10 days later, and he was screaming when he came out. He's been screaming ever since. I mean, we're wired in different ways. We're genetically different, and we are, in fact, compositions of psychoactive drugs, right? We found out decades ago about the endorphins in our body, right, which resemble the opiates, right? In fact, it may well be the case that if you take the endorphins out of your body and then put them back in, you're violating federal and state law. I'm not sure about that, right? We now know there's an endocannabinoid system, which is why marijuana seems to connect with our bodies in such remarkable ways, right? So we know that adrenaline are powerful chemicals, right? We know, or have good reason to believe we're not all born perfectly equivalent. Why is it that for some people they take an opiate drug or heroin or whatever, and they throw up, they don't like it, whatever, and for other people it's like, oh my God, I feel good. I feel normal. It's this must be how everybody else feels. The same thing, you have people with Prozac, right, or other antidepressants. We know people who've been depressed for a long time, and they take that, and all of a sudden that wrinkle of depression on their face just flattens out, and they get this thing, God, this must be what other people feel like, right? You know, and why is it that people maybe are different in their resistance or whatever to things like opiates or opiate addiction? Is it because we're born with different amounts of these endorphins, in our body, right? Is it because we were not, but we went through a childhood trauma which thereby transformed our body like that? Is it because when we started using opiates, our own body's ability to produce, endorphins, it was diminished? Is it, who knows? But what we know is that what's part of what drugs and drug policy and drug interventions are about is sort of moderating that relationship between the drugs that we are, the drugs that exist within, and the drugs that exist outside, that grow in the earth and that are produced by pharmaceutical companies and synthetic oils, and figuring out the proper way to manage that sort of stuff. We know that on some level, the ultimate challenge for any free society is not to make it drug-free, right? We know that the rhetoric of the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s of creating a drug-free society, drug-free schools, drug-free everything, was fundamentally anti-scientific. And shame on the National Institute of Drug Abuse for even putting that phrase in their publication. Shame on the United Nations for holding a global assembly on drugs in '98 and saying a drug-free world, we can do it. Because what a ludicrous, ahistorical, ahuman notion. As if there's ever been a drug-free society in the history of human civilization. With the possible exception of the Eskimos, because they couldn't grow anything, right? But I mean, apart from them, right? I mean, you're hard-pressed to find societies that did not have psychoactive drugs in one form or another, right? I mean, that's, and using for all sorts of purposes in all sorts of ways, right? So, that whole drug-free thing, which fortunately is beginning to fade in our society and many others, right? I mean, what replaces it? And I think what replaces it is the basic acceptance here and here, in mind and heart, that drugs are here to stay. Drugs have always been here, always going to be here. If anything, if we imagine a generation or two down the road, there are going to be a much greater diversity of drugs being produced legally, for sure, by pharmaceutical companies and underground chemists, and being discovered in the ground and all sorts of things, right? I mean, that is, in fact, where I think we're headed. And that the challenge is, right, not how do we get rid of it, not how do we build a moat between these drugs and our kids or ourselves, right? The challenge is, how do we learn how to live with this reality in such a way that it causes the least possible harm, and in many cases, the greatest possible good? That's the challenge with opiates, challenge with cannabis, challenge with alcohol. I mean, all of these substances have actually a lot of good associated with them in terms of pleasure, relief from pain, and also other things, and also tremendous harm and suffering and all sorts of terrible things associated with addiction and things like that. I'm going to jump to a punchline oftentimes used, but to give you one other analogy and to provoke you, especially in the public health world, there's this other substance in modern society that we have this enormous love-hate relationship with, right? It's this substance that is associated with incredible pleasure and joy and fun and just great things. And it's also this substance that's associated with incredible levels of death and suffering and harm for the human being and for the broader society, I mean, it's this thing we feel like we can't live with, we can't live without. What am I talking about? What substance am I talking about?
Sugar.
The automobile. The automobile. Are we addicted to or simply dependent upon the automobile? But think about, if you look at what's happened with the automobile in America between roughly 1910 until about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. What do you see? Numbers of cars on the road, up. Numbers of miles driven, up. Numbers of drivers, up. All the things in terms of consumption, up in remarkable amounts. Now, what do you see over the last number of decades in terms of number of people dying on the roads? Going down. Numbers of injuries, I believe, going down. Amount of pollutants being put into the environment, going down, right? Only the last few years has actually the overall incidence of consumption begun to decline with automobiles, right? Now, what that suggests is maybe the model for drugs. It's understanding that for the foreseeable future, we may be, for all sorts of reasons, talking about ever-growing amounts of consumption in terms of diversity, amounts of all sorts of things. We've seen it happen dramatically with painkillers lately. It may happen with cannabis. We don't know whether it's legal or illegal. It may happen with other substances. You know, pharmaceutical companies with all the new devices they're coming up with, right? It's going to go up. But that does not inevitably mean that the harms associated with that increase in consumption need to inevitably go up as well. That there are interventions that we can take that would remarkably reduce the harms associated with it. An issue which I'm not going to talk about because I'm not an expert in it, but the things I see happening with vaporization of consumption of previously smoked products, you see it in the marijuana field, vaporizers, the volcano, the whole sort of thing, you know, and now the more handheld vaporization devices, which it's not that important for health. If you're an occasional consumer, it doesn't make that much difference. But if you're a heavy consumer of cannabis, either for medicinal reasons or other reasons, it makes a difference because the principal harms oftentimes are those kind of burnt particle matter type stuff. Shifting to vaporization will in fact significantly reduce those harms. Move that over in the tobacco area. If we move in the direction of we basically shift. Let's assume that cigarette consumption in this country keeps going down, but we get to a point where it gets harder and harder and harder to get continual declines in that. Right? You're still going to have millions of people. We could go to prohibition, right? Prohibition might reduce consumption further, right? So there'd be less lung deaths and less emphysema and things like that. But prohibition, you'd still have a market of millions of people now buying it from the illegal market, buying it from underground producers, buying it, you know, stealing to support their now expensive habits, right? Being grown illegally in Colombia and all sorts of other parts of the world, right? Being grown illegally in the United States with massive law enforcement enterprises, you know, new federal enforcement agencies, you know, the TEA, the Tobacco Enforcement Administration, massive drug testing for tobacco. I mean, you can see what happened if you go to prohibition. So that's not it. But if in fact there's a massive shift from smoking of burnt particle matter tobacco to vaporization, people will still be just as dependent, just as hard to quit as it is now. But if you're reducing the harms by 80 to 90%, right, without having significant increases in consumption, you know, one has to, I'm not an expert on tobacco issue, but as from the public health area, if you were to be able to snap your fingers today and shift over 90 to 100% of all tobacco consumers to vaporized consumption, would that be the single greatest leap forward in public health in America or many other societies in decades, if not the century? I'm not an expert on this, but it's an issue worth thinking about. Whether the enemy is tobacco or smoked tobacco. Whether the harm reduction device in the form of vaporization might be something that works. Now, moving back to drug control policy writ large, the way I think about it is this. I think about drug policy options as arrayed along a spectrum, right? From the most draconian at the one end to the most free market, you know, libertarian at the other end. From, you know, Singapore